Good morning and welcome to the Fire Hose Chat. We're here at MIT. I'm your host from the MIT Museum, Carol Urbano. And just in case you're wondering what a Fire Hose Chat is, this series of webinars with MIT scientists comes from an old adage from former MIT president Jerome Wiesner, who said, getting an education from MIT is like a drink from a fire hose. And this saying has been so well embraced by the MIT community that there has even been a few hacks around campus attaching actual fire hoses to water fountains and such. So it really embodies the playful and sometimes intense spirit of the MIT community. Just a couple of logistical issues before we get started. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, we are going to be using the Q&A pod today. You see I have that highlighted. You can enter any questions you have there using the Q&A pod. Also, in case you didn't know this, you can actually upvote someone else's question. So if somebody has already posed a question that is very similar to yours, or maybe you're really interested in knowing the answer to that question too, you can vote for that. And that'll kind of move it up to the top of the list, because I'm sure we're not going to be able to get to all of everybody's questions today, but we'll do the best we can. And for those who are watching via Facebook Live on the Cambridge Science Festival Facebook page, you can also submit questions, and you can use the comments to do that. And we'll be curating those comments and sharing them back with our guests this morning. And of course, if you have other more logistical questions about the technical platform or other issues, you can always use the chat and we'll be able to see those questions as well. So on to our featured guest for today. We're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Ritu Raman. She is a bioengineer at the MIT Langer Lab, and she is an engineer, a writer, an educator who's passionate about bringing the biohybrid toolkit to innovators everywhere. Sometimes I wonder if there isn't anything that Ritu doesn't do. She has many accolades to her credit, including a Forbes 30 under 30. Before we hand it over to Ritu for her scientific presentation, I'm always interested in where people's passion about science came from. I've heard people say that every scientist as a young person always had an aspiration to be either astronaut, paleontologist, or archaeologist. So, Dr. Rahman, how about you?
I was definitely wanted to be an astronaut, but when I was in college, I couldn't figure out how to enroll in Intro to Aerospace Engineering. So I accidentally ended up in Intro to Bioengineering instead. And that's how I have my career today. So clearly IT was not my strong suit.
Or maybe the registrar already had a plan for you.
Yeah. That's what I believe.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to share yours. And we'd love to hear more about your work.
Sounds great. I'm going to share. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining today. I'm really excited to welcome you to my home and to share with you a little bit of my journey and how I learned how to build solutions to the problems that we face in our world using biological materials. So since Carol mentioned, I think it's really important, since we have a lot of young people joining us today, to share a little bit about why I got into science and why it's important and a rewarding part of my life and my career. So my mom, my dad, and my grandfather were all engineers. And I grew up in India, Kenya, and all over the United States. And something that stayed consistent in all of these places that I went is I saw my family use their curiosity to identify the problems that they saw in the world around them and to use their engineering and science education to build solutions to those problems. So one of those stories that I like to highlight is what we used to do when we lived in Kenya when I was quite little. So this is me right here in the red shirt. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you? Okay, so this is me, and during the week, my parents and I would live in a city called Nairobi. It's a pretty big city, but during the weekends, we would travel to pretty remote villages that weren't connected to the outside world, and my dad would help put up these communication towers that would connect these villages to the rest of the world. And this was a really, really important life lesson for me very early in my life, because it showed me that because my parents had the tools of scientific innovation, they were able to use it as a force for positive social change in their global community. So this is why, even though there were a lot of different careers that were interesting to me as I was growing up, by the time I got to college at Cornell, I knew that I really wanted to start thinking about how do I build things and make things that can solve the problems that we see in our world. So obviously that led to picking an engineering major. I chose to major in mechanical engineering, which is basically just putting materials together and building machines and robots and all other kinds of cool things. But one thing that I saw in my classes was that a lot of the things that we were learning how to build with were materials like metal or plastics or glass, things that we see our world being built with right now, right? But one thing that was missing was biological materials, or the natural materials that make up our bodies and the bodies of other animals and plants and things that surround us. And the cool thing about those kinds of materials is that they can dynamically sense and respond to their environments in real time. So if you think about, you grow a plant, you put it next to the sun, you see the leaves slowly start to face the direction of the sun. Or if you fall and you scrape your skin, you see that your skin slowly starts to heal. And these are things that if I did to my phone, if I dropped it on the floor and the screen cracked, it doesn't heal, right? And I would love for that to be able to happen, because if we had some more responsive machines, maybe we would be able to tackle even bigger challenges that we aren't able to currently tackle with our machines that we have today. So to build with biological materials really requires an enabling technology. So a lot of you may have heard of something called 3D printing, which is basically a broad term applied to a lot of different types of machines that all operate on essentially the same principle. They pattern like a 2D layer, and then they build layer by layer from the bottom up. They can build very complex 3D structures. So during my first year of graduate school at the University of Illinois, I built a type of 3D printer that could pattern living cells and biological materials like proteins into very complex 3D shapes, like this three-dimensional heart that I printed that you can see on this lower left-hand corner. So if you have these sorts of tools to build with biology, you can do things like make a heart or other types of tissues that are in our bodies, essentially reverse engineer things that already exist in nature. But one thing that I was really interested in is, I am a pretty creative person. I have a big imagination. So can I put together these biological materials with a 3D printer in a way that doesn't mimic what already exists in nature, something that's new and different? So this idea of what we call forward engineering is what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So forward engineering means, can we put together biological materials to make a new kind of machine? One specific type of machine that I find really interesting are robots. So a lot of you probably have a picture of a robot in your head. It might look like, I don't know, like C3PO or R2D2, like, these sort of anthropomorphic metallic machines. And that's certainly what some robots could look like. But broadly defined, a robot is essentially just any device that can sort of sense, process, and autonomously respond to a signal from its environment in real time. So a biological robot, or biobot, that's what I like to call them, is a robot that uses biological materials to perform one or all of these functions, sensing or processing or response. And my hope, and the hope of a lot of people that work in this space, is that hopefully these sort of biologically integrated robots or biohybrid robots could have some of the dynamic responsive capabilities of biological materials in our own bodies, and could be able to tackle some bigger challenges than traditional robots made out of synthetic materials could do. Well, I was very lucky, because the year that I started graduate school in 2012, 2 papers came out of robots that use biological materials to move and walk around. So the one on the left, can you see the video, Carolyn? Yeah, okay. So one on the left is a swimming robot that kind of looks like a jellyfish, and the one on the right is a walking robot that kind of looks like a worm. And both of these are actually made using very similar technologies. They're a flexible polymer, like plastic kind of material, on top of which researchers put a sheet of cardiac muscle cells. So these are the same cells that make up our hearts. So essentially they all beat at the same time, and they're able to create these large forces that help these robots move and walk around and navigate in their environment. So they use cardiac cells because cardiac cells produce very large forces and they beat all at the same time and they never turn off, which is really great for our hearts. We don't want those to turn off. But some of the limitations of using these cells is that engineers like to have robots that they can turn on and off, right? Like you don't want your TV running all the time or your blender running all the time. You want that to be able to turn on or off. And cardiac muscle also has very limited capacity to regenerate after damage. That's why we have, really severe consequences if people have things like heart attacks. So it's really important to think about another source of cells to be able to generate these kinds of forces. So again, we look to biology. So in our bodies, we use skeletal muscle to move and walk around, as do a lot of other animals. And we do this because skeletal muscle is a really, really cool actuator. An actuator is basically anything that converts chemical or electrical energy into mechanical energy, like force output. So skeletal muscle as an actuator, if you compare it to things like motors and other kinds of actuators that we have in our life, actually produces larger forces from smaller volumes than most of these synthetic actuators. And it's powered entirely by sugar and a lot of different types of proteins and amino acids. And it can heal in response to damage and also get stronger when you exercise. So it has a lot of capabilities that some of the traditional actuators that we work with don't have. So if we could use these to make a machine, it could be a really cool thing. So to make a machine powered by skeletal muscle, we pursued a design that was inspired by biology. We call that bio-inspired design. So in our bodies, we have muscle that is tethered to our bone by relatively stiff tendons and stretched across an articulating joint like our elbows. And when the muscle receives a signal to contract from neurons in our brain and our spinal cord, it contracts and we can generate these large motions. And we can do the same thing in the lab by 3D printing a low stiffness beam that mimics this articulating joint, connecting to high stiffness pillars that mimic this tendon. And around that, we can sort of, if you guys have ever, injected Jello solution into a mold and watched it solidify, we essentially do the same thing, except instead of using Jello, we use cells mixed with protein. So that's what you see in pink here, that pink gel. And the cool thing about biology is that's basically all you have to do. The biological materials have a lot of pre-programmed instructions on how to assemble their environment. So the cells reproduce and they proliferate. They spread across this gel. They compact it into this pretty dense 3D strip of muscle. And eventually the cells fuse together to form these long fibers that you see in green here in this picture that are the basic contractile element of muscle. So they're the things that help muscle generate force and produce motion. And so this is what the tissue looks like from the side. So here's the muscle and here's the skeleton that we printed. And you can see that the muscle is starting to produce some force, which is forcing this flat beam to get sort of curved. And the cool thing is that if we know how stiff that material is and how much it's bending and what size it is, we can actually use this relatively simple equation that I show here to back calculate how much force is being produced by the muscle. And using that, you can learn a lot of different things about how the muscle responds to its environment. So we learned things like if you culture the muscle or you grow the muscle on a stiffer skeleton, they actually get stronger in response to that stiffer environment. Or if in the food that you give the muscle, you add in certain types of growth factors, they also get stronger. So you can already start to see that when you build with biology, it's everything that's happening in its environment is affecting how the machine functions and responds. We can also generate force from these muscles. So similar to the electrical stimulus that our muscles in our body received from our brains, we can simulate those inside the lab by putting our robot in between two electrodes made out of platinum wire. We send an electrical pulse through the tissue, and every time you send a pulse, the muscle contracts. And if you send 2 pulses per second or 2 hertz contraction, it contracts twice per second, and more and more and more and more, all the way up until about 10 hertz, where you reach something called tetanus. The reason this happens is that when you stimulate once per second, the muscle contracts and then it relaxes back to its baseline, right? But if you start stimulating them more and more frequently, it can't relax all the way back down before it has to contract again. And if you keep doing this too frequently, you eventually reach something called tetanus, which also happens in our body, where if we're overstimulated, we basically can't move. So this is really important because it shows us that the muscle is behaving just like the muscle inside our body. But we want to do something cool, right? We want to make these robots move and walk around. And if you have a purely symmetric structure, you can imagine that the muscle, if it contracts, would do something like this, but which is kind of cool. It's like a dance move, but the robot's not really going anywhere or doing anything. But if you make the robot a little asymmetric, so you make one of the legs a little bit longer than the other, in this case, it's the left leg in this picture here, that leg is going to move a little bit more every time the muscle contracts, and the robot slowly moves in the direction of the longer leg. And this is, in fact, what we see in this video here. So here, the left leg is a little bit longer, and every time the muscle contracts, the robot is slowly crawling in the direction of the left leg. And you actually can control the speed at which the robot walks by increasing the frequency of stimulation. So if you stimulate it at 4 hertz, the muscle is contracting 4 times per second, and the robot's really hurrying over to the left side of the screen. So that was a very exciting study for us because it was the first experiment that showed that an engineered skeletal muscle could be used to make a robot that moved and walked around. But there were a couple things that kind of bothered me about that work when I was done with it, because I was like, what if I don't always want a robot that walks in one direction? What if I want a robot that can like move and walk around in a lot of different directions? And also, what if I don't want a robot that just walks? Like I want it to swim or pump or do a lot of different types of things. So I made 2 changes. One, we used genetic engineering tools to help the cells be responsive not only to electrical stimuli, but also to light stimuli. So if you flash blue light on them, we could get them to the muscle to contract. And we also switched to injection molding, sort of jello molding the tissue in the shape of a ring or rubber band. So what this allows us to do, allows us to pick up the ring or rubber band out of our molds and then transfer it to any type of skeleton that we want. So here it's our traditional 2-leg walking skeleton that I showed you before, but other people have used this technology to like snap multiple of these rings around a tube and make a pump. People have used this for a lot of different types of robots that accomplish different functional behaviors beyond walking. So if we have these sort of cells, we again kind of can dive deep. We can stain these tissues with different sort of fluorescent dyes to look at what's going on inside. And we start seeing that the tissue is, again, very responsive to its environment. So in the center of this tissue, where it's being stretched by the skeleton, sort of holding it this way, you can see all of the fibers that are contracting within the muscle, are aligned in the same direction. This means when they all contract individually, they're all producing force in the same direction. And so they're able to coordinate their force production in a very clever way. And you can also see that this green indicator of mature muscle is distributed throughout the thickness of the tissue. So this is like if you cut the muscle in half and looked at it from the side, you can see that throughout the whole tissue, there's this green dye, which means that all of the tissue is contractile or functional. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we wanted to do, again, the same experiments that we did before, except instead of using electrical stimulus, we use a light stimulus. So we flash blue light on these cells, and every time we flash blue light, we got the muscle to contract, bringing that sort of skeleton, deforming it. And we saw essentially the same behavior as before. So if you do 1 hertz stimulation contraction, you get 1 muscle contraction per second. It goes back down to baseline. As you go faster and faster, you have the same response until that tetanus or freezing response that I talked about before. But I'm sure you don't want to look at data and we'd rather look at videos. So here's a video of the same type of robot that we were talking about before. In this video, the right leg is actually a little bit longer and the robot slowly crawls in the direction of the longer leg. So this is the skeleton right here, and the center part in the middle is the muscle tissue. Where is it? There it is. And you can see it's sort of slowly crawling. Can't do. They're able to respond to their environment in a really cool and exciting way and show the promise for what a biological machine can do. So these are some of the first steps that we've taken in building robots or machines with biological materials, but there are a lot of evolving directions in this area. So right now, what the robots can do is like generate force and produce motion, right? but our bodies can do a lot of different types of things. And maybe we can learn from that to incorporate other types of cells or functionalities into these robots. So we could incorporate, say, blood vessel-like structures, a vascular network within these tissues to be able to transport nutrients to different parts of the robot. Or we could, right now they're responsive to electrical and light stimulus, but maybe we could incorporate certain types of sensory neurons and things in our skin that maybe help us feel pressure or heat, and incorporate those sorts of functionalities into the robot so that they could sense a lot of different things in their environment and respond to them. And what I'm really focused on is not just sort of improving the functionality of these robots, but thinking about how we can implement them in the real world to solve real problems and challenges that we all face. So something that I'm really interested in is in the area of implantable devices, or things like prosthetics or insulin pumps or different medicines that help us recover from disease or damage to our body. Every person has a very different manifestation of an illness or damage, and every person needs a very different kind of care that's personalized to their individual need. So you can imagine that having a device that has biological materials and can sense and respond to what each individual needs over time might be able to help us advance human health in a way that implantable devices made purely out of the synthetic materials that we traditionally build with can't do. And the last thing that I've been doing is I've been finding ways to teach all different people, at least at the undergraduate and graduate level, how to build with biological materials and make their own biobots to address a lot of different types of challenges. And my hope is to spread that sort of curriculum around the world one day. So a lot of you, even if you're not interested in a bioengineering career, can have a little bit of hands-on experience just to learn what it's like to build with biology. So before I take any questions, I do want to thank all of the different labs around the country that help do this work. And I know that at least with the North Anglia students, we shared a lot of podcasts and other resources you can listen to learn more about this technology. But for those of you who are more sort of verbal learners, I also have a 1,000-word essay that was published in Science magazine last year called Modeling Muscle that covers a lot of these topics and some others as well. So if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend reading it. And if we're not able to get to your question today, I have my email, my website, and my Twitter on the bottom of this slide. Feel free to reach out and ask any questions that I didn't get to answer, but hopefully we'll get to answer a lot of questions right now.
Thanks, Ritu. We actually have one student has their hand raised. So Hansika, I'm going to unmute your mic and you should be able to ask your question directly. While we're connecting to Hansika, we do have lots of other questions in the Q&A pod. And a lot of them are about, are related to your work around the applications for this. You talked about some of the possible applications. Do you have a vision of other fields or specifically in medicine?
Sure. Yeah. I can talk maybe a little bit about medicine, for example. So one thing that a lot of us might be familiar with is something like a wearable pump, like an insulin pump that people who have diabetes might have to wear to regulate the levels of insulin that are in their bloodstream. And as you can imagine, that's very dependent from person to person. It can be very dependent on what they're eating that day and their condition. So if we were able to make a pump that was powered by biological materials and could maybe connect to their bodies in some way and measure, what are the levels of insulin in this person's bloodstream right now, or different sorts of biomarkers for a different type of drug, it could potentially adjust its response and adjust how much of something it's delivering to the body because it's made out of the same types of biological materials that we are and is able to connect to those systems. Another type of response is just in restoring the locomotion. So I said a little bit about how, if we play soccer and we hurt ourselves or we fall down or hurt ourselves, maybe, we can heal that using our natural biological systems. But there's a lot of injuries that we know can't be healed purely using our natural biological systems, right? We see people who maybe lose a large chunk of their tissue. They might lose a leg or a portion of their leg. And then we're not able to naturally regenerate that. And we have to supplement that with something like a prosthetic or an implant that helps. You know, if it's in the leg, it's moving and walk around. If it's in the hand, it's maybe reaching out and gripping and holding things and writing. But if we were able to make these sorts of muscles out of natural cells that could integrate with our surrounding body, we would maybe be able to say, print these robots. So these robots are pretty small right now. They're about a few millimeters. But if we can learn how to incorporate vascular networks within them and make them be able to transport nutrients in a bigger structure, we can make even bigger chunks of tissue. And if we were able to make bigger chunks of tissue, say if you lost a portion of tissue in your arm, we could replace that with a new existing engineered tissue. And we could do some of the things that we learned from the damage study, like exercising or using different sorts of biological factors and growth factors to help that muscle connect with your surrounding blood vessels, connect with the nervous system that innervates that tissue, and help recover the force production and locomotion that you had before. So those are a couple of the sort of implantable device potential areas that this sort of technology could impact.
Great. Just a follow-on to that, one student is really interested in what is the process of deconstruction, and how does this? How similar is it to taking a pill?
So I think the really cool thing about this technology is that it's very scalable in size. So we have these rubber band or ring-like muscle structures. We can have them be pretty small, or we can make them using a lot more types of cells, or we can stack them on top of each other. So it's very dependent on the application. So for example, work that I didn't present today is that I made a material that's not biological, but acts like a biological material. It breaks down when you shine light on it. So it's like very responsive to a light stimulus in its environment. And we use that to actually make a pill that you swallow. When it reaches your stomach, it blows up like a balloon. It takes up a lot of space. And this is intended to help people who are struggling with obesity. So it takes up a lot of space in their stomach. It makes them feel full. They don't eat as much, and it helps them lose weight. Now, currently, there are other balloons like this that exist in the world. But what they do is they have to do an endoscopy, which is basically like a medical procedure where they stick something down your throat and they have to like retrieve that balloon from inside your body. But the cool thing about having a material, a device that's made out of a responsive material, is that we showed you could just swallow a pill, another pill that had an LED or light inside it, and it would go and it would dock with that balloon that was in its stomach, and it would tell it to break down. It would break down, and you would essentially just poop it out like you poop out the food that you eat every day. So it can be made, these sorts of things, they're very modular. You can design them in a lot of different form factors. So if you were doing something that you wanted to swallow as a pill, you would probably design it in that sort of form factor. But if you were doing something where it was like a chunk of muscle that you wanted to replace inside your body, you would have to do something like a surgery to do that. So it's very dependent on the application.
Thank you. I'm going to take one of the questions from Curtis. You should be able to pose your question.
Hi. So I was wondering if technologies like CRISPR could be applied to the biobots for capabilities like perhaps rapid healing or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So for those of you who aren't familiar, CRISPR is a gene editing tool that allows us to put different sorts of little bits and pieces of DNA into an existing DNA structure. So that's pretty similar to actually what we did with our robots to make them responsive to light. So the way we did that is we took a regular skeletal muscle cell, and in the membrane of that cell, we put a certain type of protein called an ion channel that's actually derived from algae, not something that is traditionally involved in skeletal muscle, right? So algae has something that helps it respond to light so that the algae can move and sense the sun, and move to an area where there's more light or sun. And so we took that protein from algae and we genetically engineered the skeletal muscle cells to have that protein, which is how the skeletal muscle cells became responsive to light, because they're not like that inside our body. And certainly that's something that I'm very interested in doing in the future is, are there other sorts of things, other sorts of features from other plants or animals that it might be helpful for cells in our robots to have? And if so, can we use genetic engineering tools to incorporate those functionalities into these robots?
Great. Okay, Roshan, you have a question for us?
Yeah. Dr. Ritu, how does it get power to move?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you can imagine, all I've told you is that they're being controlled by electrical stimulus or light stimulus, right? But I haven't told you, where's the battery? Where are you plugging it in? So in our bodies, we're essentially getting energy to do all of these things, essentially from like sugar and fat that's being converted to ATP. Some of you who've taken some higher level biology classes may be a little familiar with that cycle, but it's not super important to know that. The really important thing to know is that the source of power, the battery in this case, is the liquid that's surrounding the robot. So all of the robots that I showed you were sitting in a liquid. That liquid was warm and had a lot of sugar and amino acids in it. And that was essentially the place from which the muscle was deriving its nutrients and its power source. And that's what was helping it contract and produce motion.
Is it possible for you to create a membrane of the liquid to make the muscle and the rest of the robot able to swallow the nutrients while still staying out of the liquid tub?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. You guys are asking some good questions. I'm actually applying for jobs right now, and I pitch like a lot of future research ideas that I want to do, and this is one of them. So one thing that if we wanted to make these robots move and walk around and operate in different sorts of environment, we don't necessarily always want them sitting in like a big vat of liquid, right? So if we could have them have some sort of exoskeleton or like a synthetic skin, similar to how our skin contains all of the nutrients that the muscle inside the skin needs, that would certainly be one way to address that limitation. So we could have, say, if the muscle or robot was like this, we could have something around it that was containing the liquid battery solution that the muscle would need, and that would help it remain functional for a long period of time. So there's a lot of really cool work and research to be done in that space for sure.
Great. I'm going to take a question from Shiloh.
So how did you get inspired to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure it can seem, like, how does somebody come up with all of these ideas? It's not something that came to me overnight. And when I give a talk like this, I can understand that sometimes it might seem like it happened overnight. So maybe I'll share a little bit about how I got into the specific field. When I was about 16 or 17 years old as an undergrad at Cornell. I don't think I have any pictures of that. But essentially, one of my first jobs was in a biology lab. I wasn't interested in biology. I just happened to get a job in that lab, and I needed it to sort of build my resume. So I got a job in this lab, and in that lab, they knew that people who drink a lot of alcohol or too much alcohol have their skeletal muscle degenerate or degrade over time. And they also knew that people who exercise a lot are pretty strong, right? And their muscle grows and builds over time. So they wanted to see if in an animal study with rats, they wanted to see if they had something that consumes a lot of bad, too many toxic ingredients, like too much alcohol, but also exercise a lot. Can those things sort of balance each other out? And my job was essentially to study how this happened by taking these little rats, having them drink alcohol and then get on treadmills and then run for like half an hour or a couple hours. And then we would slowly start seeing that the rats that were exercising a lot and eating healthy were having very healthy muscle and bulking up and having much more positive outcomes. And that exercise alone wasn't able to countermand or counteract having very negative stimuli in terms of diet. So like both diet and exercise was important to have these skeletal muscles working as they should be. So this experience was really interesting to me because at this point I wasn't thinking about muscle at all, right? I was a mechanical engineer and I was used to building stuff with like metal or plastics. And I was like, this is so cool how the materials in our bodies are able to respond to their environment so dynamically. And none of the things that I work with in my daily life are able to do that other than my own body. So I would say that that was probably the experience that got me really interested in thinking about muscle. And from that, everything was sort of a small step from there. Like, oh, if we use muscle to move and walk around, maybe we can make a robot that uses muscle to move and walk around, and started asking more and more questions around that space. And all the work that I presented today is the work of, several years.
We have a kind of a related question to that. Kevin wants to know if you want to learn biotech or bioengineering early, what are the ways that you can do that to get on board early?
Yeah. So this is a really great thing. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of you are learning now in current times that there are a lot of great online learning modules for getting this sort of maybe not hands-on experience, but exposure to a lot of different things that biotechnologists and bioengineers are doing. But if you do want a little more hands-on experience, I think that there's a lot of really cool things that you can learn how to do with like microbiology or bacteria. So most of the cells that I work with are cells from mammals, and they have to be grown in like very clean labs and like maintained at a certain temperature. And so generally it's easier to work with them when you have access to a lab like that. But there's a lot of different types of toolkits for microbiology. I think the iGEM program in the United States, at least, has a lot of really cool tools that you can try to leverage or try to recreate in your classroom setting or perhaps in your home, where there are certain sort of small experiments that you can try to do to start thinking about how you can use biological materials as building blocks. One thing that I hope to be able to do, so we've done a little bit of research on how we can take our biobots and sort of freeze them. And when they freeze, they sort of are preserved in the state that they're kept in for a while. And eventually we've shown that when we thaw them, they recover and they can generate force and produce motion, just like they were able to do before. And so something that I want to be able to do, hopefully sometime in the future, is be able to freeze down a bunch of these tissues and maybe send them to a lot of different people in classrooms around the world and see if they could, take the muscle and put it around a skeleton robot that they've built, or play with the robots that we freeze down and send them. So it gives a lot more people exposure to how these technologies like look and feel. I think that's something that's really important, that's hard to get from online learning. Sometimes like when you pick something up and stretch it or see it in front of you, you can get maybe a little bit of a deeper experience. So I think a combination of trying to do hands-on things as well as online things could be very helpful. Actually, one more thing I'd like to add is that I get emails from a lot of students around the world all of the time. And I actually really like them, and I try to answer as many of them as I can. And I'm sure a lot of other scientists feel the same way as well. So if you hear about something in the news, you're reading a news article and you see a new thing that comes out and you have a question about it, maybe think about reaching out to the professor or the researcher who did that science. And a lot of them will try to find time to answer that question for you.
Thanks, Ritu. Your vision of shipping these all around the world to classrooms is really quite a powerful one. And of course, I jump on, oh, how can I make that happen? And the first question that came to my mind was around the logistics around shipping cells. And as it turns out, one of our students, Alexa, is interested in this question about at what point is a biobot considered a living organism, which I might have to put that on my shipping form.
Yeah. That is a great question. It's actually something that we think about a lot. So all of these researchers I've listed on these slides, many of these people and I have come up with a range of sort of ethics questions or vignettes or things that we need to think about when we think about building something with biological materials. So I think the really important thing to remember, like you said here, is to understand that there's a difference between a living material and a living being. So cells in a dish or a plate, we've been using those for years and years and years to sort of understand how the cells in our body move and walk around, or how they might respond to a certain drug, for example. But we haven't necessarily put them together into a machine, right? And so the question becomes, at some point, it is possible, right? Like, if we put more and more different types of cells, or integrate some sort of decision making, or maybe make them be able to replicate or reproduce in some way, that we would then be creating something that we would call a living organism. And to me, I think it's really important to define what those lines are early on. And a lot of what I do in my work is work with other researchers, policymakers, and also people who aren't scientists but are interested in like philosophy and ethics and the political ramifications of this, to all come together and make a set of rules on what we think qualifies as like a living being, and to not do that, because my interest is never to do science that isn't useful or impactful to other people. I really want to use robots, these kinds of robots, to help solve some of the really big health challenges that we all have and help us lead healthier and longer lives. And so my goal is to really identify what those limitations are beforehand, and stay within those, and encourage other researchers to stay within those, and focus towards doing research that's really impactful and helpful towards other people. And certainly it's important in this type of research, but it's actually important in all types of science and technology. Anytime you come up with a new science tool or technology, you can say, oh, like, a lot of good can be done with this tool, but there's also the potential that somebody could use it to do something negative. So it's really important for us as a global community, not only as scientists, to do work responsibly, but for all of us, even if who aren't scientists, to cultivate a basic sense of literacy and understanding of science, and be able to understand why people are doing what they're doing, and communicate your concerns about that, so that we can all work together to ensure that the work that we're doing is impactful for the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I believe that we have shared in Global Campus some of the exercises and vignettes that Ritu referred to. So you can even practice thinking about and reflecting on and writing and arguing particular sides of these ethical questions, either on your own or with your classmates. I'm going to take another question from the phone. So we have Indrani. You should be able to ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Raman. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, hi. First of all, I would like to appreciate for your incredible work. And this is really amazing. I would like to ask you, how safe is it for human body? And are we using this biorobos in medical field or hospitals currently? If you can share some examples, that will be great.
Sure. Yeah. So we're certainly in a pretty early stage of this research. So a lot of what I've done and showed you has been done in the lab. But my goal is to eventually be able to use these things inside bodies or in hospital settings to advance human health. Now, to be able to do that and to be able to do that safely, we need to be able to make sure through the same sort of regulatory mechanisms that we currently have to validate medicines or implantable devices inside our body, we make sure that the materials are biocompatible, which means that they're safe for use with cells. We've done a lot of that preliminary testing in the lab, but whenever you transition something from the lab to the real world, there's a lot more rigorous testing that needs to happen. So there will be sort of early stage clinical trials to assess safety, and then larger, bigger clinical trials with more people to assess efficacy or how effective something is, and that would be for every potential application. So the nice thing is that it's a new material, and it's certainly a very revolutionary way to think about building machines, but we also have a lot of the infrastructure set into place and thinking about how we can use these safely in a clinical setting based on some of the other technologies that we've already developed. So we would operate within that same infrastructure and make sure that the things that we were building are safe and useful.
So we have a number of questions in the Q&A pod that are talking about very specific applications. So in part of your vision, do you also see things like cancer, diabetes? How might some of these other diseases that are very familiar to us, and we all tend to know someone within our circle that might be impacted by some of these diseases, how might they benefit from your biobots?
Yeah, so I think that we talked a little bit about like the diabetes application a little bit before. One thing that I haven't worked on, but other people in my lab at MIT, run by Bob Langer, have worked on, is these new types of sort of cell-based implants that we can put inside our body that can act as sort of factories that produce insulin inside our bodies and respond to the needs of an individual. For cancers also, for example, there's a lot of soft tissue cancers or sarcomas where you might have to, you might have a tumor, and then in order to prevent that from spreading to the rest of your body, a surgeon might need to cut that out of your body or cut that piece of tissue out. And then you're left with this huge chunk of damage, right, that you can't recover on your own. So that's a situation where also being able to engineer replacements, not only of muscle, but maybe of bone or cartilage. These are also things that a lot of people are working on, engineering replacements for a lot of different types of tissues. We could think about how can we replace portions of those with healthy cells that can help you restore the form and function that you had before the damage induced by cancer or an accident or another type of disease. I think you're muted, Carol.
Thank you. Zenith, you should be able to ask your question.
I don't think I can hear her.
Yeah, okay, so we'll move on to our next student, Varvar.
Well, my question is, what other benefits of bioengineering apart from medicine are there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry. I think I missed the second half, but I can talk a little bit about the other applications of bioengineering. So certainly I focus on medical applications because that's something that's very interesting to me, but there's a lot of different types of applications that are important for this technology, but also for beyond the work that I do, the work that other people do as well. So a couple of things that I've thought about for this technology, for example, is that if we know how to make large chunks of tissue made out of skeletal muscle and fat and things like that, a lot of people have thought, well, really, this is essentially what meat is, and we didn't need to get it from an animal, right? We were able to print it in a lab because we have all of these cells and we can grow them in the lab. So a lot of people have started thinking about whether they can improve the sustainability of our food production system by being able to make tissues like this in a lab and freeze it and ship it out for people to eat and incorporate into their food. So there's possible potential applications in agriculture, things beyond muscle or meat. I'm vegetarian, so I eat a lot of like vegetables and grains. And a lot of bioengineering tools have developed to help us understand how to make plants and grains that are more robust and sustainable, and can be able to produce the food that we need for our global population. So I think food and agriculture is a big thing. There's a lot of really interesting work actually also being done in things like water filtration. So there's a really cool, I talked about how we put a protein called an ion channel that opened and closed in response to light in our skeletal muscle. There's a lot of different types of proteins or ion channels inside our body that open and close for different things. So there's something called Aquaporin that's a channel that lets in water molecules into systems like cells. And people have used that to make sort of filters to filter things like, dirty water or salty water, and be able to get fresh drinking water out at the end of it. So these are all very many applications of bioengineering technologies, and some of the technologies that I talked here that might be important to us in our world beyond medicine.
Great. All right. Let's see. Let me take Matthew.
So I was just wondering, right? So the robot that you had built, right? It's specifically running on like a particular wavelength. So wouldn't it be more effective if it would like run on any possible other source of light? So like if it ran on sunlight per se?
It depends on kind of what you want. So I think that certainly being able to respond to sunlight might be interesting if you wanted it to always be working during the daytime, for example. And sunlight has a lot of different wavelengths, as you know, and one of those might be the blue light or some other light within the tissue that would be able to respond to sunlight, but then you would not be able to turn it off during the day unless you kept it dark. So I think it's very dependent on kind of what you need from the robot, maybe in a certain situation. So one thing that's not so great about blue light is that when you put it through something that's thick, like a piece of tissue, the intensity of that light actually dies down pretty quickly. But red light and infrared light actually travels really deep into our tissue. So if we wanted to interact with a biological robot that was, pretty deeply embedded inside our bodies, we might want to maybe make it responsive to red light instead of blue light. And to do that, we would need to be able to essentially genetically engineer the cells, find a protein that's responsive to red light, and be able to incorporate these into these cells. So it's a combination of, can we find that? Can we integrate it into the cells? And if so, then certainly we could leverage not only being responsive to different wavelengths of light or a lot of different wavelengths of light, but also things like temperature or pressure or different types of stimuli.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And Isabel.
Hi, so my question is, how do you think the future will change for jobs? Will this cause people to lose jobs, or will they be more efficient?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that with any new technology, I think we could have a concern about losing jobs when we think about not retraining the next generation or the existing generation to have the tools to be able to work with these sorts of things. So in my world, I think if we can make a lot of different types of machines or implantable devices, as long as we're able to retrain the workforce to be able to build with these materials or machines, I think that would hopefully have a positive impact on the economy and not a negative one. But it is really important, not only for researchers, but also our communities in general and policymakers to think about, when technology is changing so rapidly, learning has to be very lifelong, right? Like we can't just stop when we're teenagers or in our early 20s and then think that we're going to get to 90 and never have to learn anything new. So I think that we do have to rethink a little bit of our education structure throughout our lives and think about how can we train people who maybe didn't learn about stuff like this in school, like you're learning about. Maybe they're 30 or 40 or 60 years old, and they want to be able to learn how to use these tools and technologies. We have to think of ways to be able to train those people as well, so that we're not leaving anyone behind every time we make a new technological advance. So I think that that's not only up to scientists, but also up to all of us in our community to work towards that.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ritu, for your time. As I mentioned, for those of you that are joining from the North Anglia schools, on Global Campus, you'll be able to find some of the some additional work from Ritu, the background of her work. And if Ritu sends along that paper, I'll be sure to make sure that gets posted there as well. And, I do encourage folks to check out the bioethics modules that Ritu shared with us. I think they are a great way to think about this. And the specific vignettes, I think, are very a very powerful framing for serving as a foundation for reflection as we move forward. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next Firehose Chat on April 29th.
Thank you, everyone.